Okay, so this talk is called Animatedness in the Filipino Performing Body. This was quite interesting because this week I only found out about this group called Fourth Impact, who have stormed X Factor UK. I haven't watched any of it, the X Factor this year, but I think that this is quite interesting. But I'll play a little clip.
Hello.
I'm just really excited for you to show just what you do.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Thank you so much.
On the first page of our story, the future seems so bright. When this thing turned out so evil, don't know why I'm still surprised. Even angels have the weekend schemes, and you take that to new extremes. You'll always be my hero, even though you've lost your mind. Just gonna stand there and watch me burn. That's alright, because I like the way it hurts. Just gonna stand there and hear me cry. But that's alright, because I love the way you lie. Just gonna stand there and watch me burn. But that's alright, because I like the way it hurts. Just gonna stand there and hear me cry. That's alright, because I like the way you
So I think it's quite interesting how this has been presented and edited. Like when I was looking at it after the fact, these girls have come from the Philippines, and they apparently came only for the X Factor. But of course now, almost immediately the Mirror revealed that they weren't, amateur singers, that they were actually professionals, that they performed all over Asia. Because of course they are, because the visa rules mean that the producers would have had to invite them into the country. So it's interesting how the television show is presenting the spectacle of brown bodies performing Western pop music. So I think that the colonial gaze in that video, and what will be interesting to see where it goes with Fourth Impact on the show, is part of a larger genre of YouTube videos that I like to call viral Filipinos. And so, bring it up again. This is just one example.
Original Gilbert, I'm from in Marcus Village, Mabalacat, Pampanga. I'm singing the Justin Bieber, the baby. Oh, you know you love me, I know you care. Just shout and never, and I'll be there. You want my love, you want my heart, and we will never, ever, ever be apart. Are we an item? Got me there. We're just friends, but when I see your face.
This video is called Filipino Street Kid with Amazing Singing Talent Must Watch. And the description says, this video is showcasing the very talented homeless kid from Pampanga, Philippines, with a very nice voice. Please help spread this video. He has really good potential in singing. So this street kid is an Aeta, one of the Austronesian groups native to northern Luzon, named Arjon Gilbert. In a second video, he's accompanied by a white man who goes by the username of Jothan Goats, who claims that my wife and I befriended Arjon and his friend DJ Ryan recently, and Arjon asked us to help him get it discovered. However, according to the journalist Carmela G. La Peña, our John was already discovered 2 years prior to his most recent YouTube video when he appeared on a television show in the Philippines called Wish Ko Lang, which means I wish, where he was given a videoke mic, scholarship grant for sessions at the Center for Pop Music Philippines, Inc., which is quite similar to the Institute, I think, and a contract with GMA Artist Center. And 2 years later, our John was still selling handmade flutes on the streets in Pampanga. Gilbert's viral fame points to a larger phenomenon of Filipino racialization. His videos aren't an isolated phenomenon. Others of the genre include the top one, street girl bibingka vendor with an amazing voice, and at the bottom, two guys in Cebu singing Bruno Mars. These numerous clips show young Filipino singers framed by local foliage at local talent shows in the provinces. There are often references in the description or comments to Ellen or Oprah, which references Ellen DeGeneres and Oprah Winfrey, both of whom have featured undiscovered Filipino singers on their television talk shows. The spectacle of the brown body is surrounded by these signifiers of the third world, adeptly mimicking the musical idioms of America, and is aimed at a colonizing gaze which consumes the spectacle, is fascinated by it, and demands more. So, when I started embarking on this research last year, I was chatting to my Filipino mother back in Vancouver, Canada over Skype. I told her that my next project would examine Philippine performance from large-scale national theaters to everyday social performances of self. I mentioned that I was interested in decolonizing gestures, and she nodded her head sagely as if to validate my choice of topic. She moved her hands up and down on the video screen, perhaps an unconscious reference to the Singkil folk dance, and she said, "Filipinos are very graceful in their movement. We are very natural performers." So, even Filipinos are not exempt from buying into the stereotype that Filipinos are not only good performers, but natural ones. It's a point of cultural pride that Filipinos love singing and dancing, are overtly theatrical or dramatico, setting Filipinos apart from other East Asian ethnic groups who tend to be stereotyped as inscrutable, quiet, or emotionless. And this perception then has negative connotations as well. Filipinos are held to be overdramatic, overloud, showy, fussy, demanding, or mararte, which is a Tagalog term meaning overacting. And I asked a Filipino friend to translate that for me. He said it doesn't just mean overacting, it's like being akin to, and this is his words, akin to being a fussy woman. So furthermore, the stereotypical perception also holds that while Filipinos may love performing, their performances also lack authenticity because they merely mimic Western forms and idioms. And this two-pronged stereotype of Filipinos as both highly skilled singers and dancers and excellent mimics enables an illusion between subject and object, from Filipino performer to Filipino as performing body. And this marks a Filipino circulation within a neo-colonial system of transnational labor and exchange. The Filipino as performing body appears in a number of domains, including viral videos, pop music, musical theater, but also cover bands who perform in hotels across Asia, hostesses, entertainers in Japan, call center workers for multinational corporations, and the everyday performances of millions of Filipinos around the world performing affective labor as overseas contract workers. So in the global conditions of its labor, the Filipino performing body is defined by adaptability and flexibility. So, at the risk of this project creating a general theory of Filipinos, I want to argue that what unifies these aforementioned appearances of the Filipino performer is a generalized perception of a lack of agency. The Filipino literary theorist Epifanio San Juan evocatively describes Filipino subjects as belonging to the world, which suggests a kind of global citizenship on the one hand, but on the other suggests that the Filipino is owned by everyone else. So I want to conceptualize the Filipino performing body as animated in a double sense. On the one hand, it's lively. On the other hand, it's animated as in moved by external forces outside his or her own volition, as in cultural theorist Sean Nye's concept of animatedness. Animatedness in Nye's reading is an affect that adheres to racialized subjects who are excessively emotional, in other words, controlled or moved by their own emotion. In this paper, I want to supplement Nai's reading. For the animated Filipino performing body is not purely moved, for the affect of animatedness is always produced or performed from somewhere. So, in framing the Filipino performing body by the theatrical, we might see the potential for decolonizing gestures by drawing attention to the labor of being dramatical. I'll explore this reanimation in the theatrical through two examples. So number one is the appearance of Filipino performers in the West End musical Miss Saigon. And more speculatively, number two, the audition of a young Kundiman singer named Juvie Pelos on the television show The Voice of the Philippines, which is the Filipino version of The Voice. So while both these examples, commercial musical theater and commercial television, exist within a system of globalized labor, I suggest they index an alternative standpoint, another means of thinking the Philippine subject. So this next section is called Colonial Mimicry. Reflecting on his career in 1988, the anthropologist Renato Rizaldo wrote, quote, "When I was a grad student contemplating fieldwork in the Philippines, one of my professors warned me that Filipinos have no culture." End quote. What he meant, perhaps, was that Filipinos had no singular pre-colonial tribal culture and that he should seek elsewhere for a richer source of ethnographic data. Rizaldo ignored this advice and began years of fieldwork in northern Luzon, developing a concept of imperialist nostalgia in which people mourn the passing of what they themselves have destroyed. While this concept is often applied to representations of the colonial journey by the colonizer, in the Philippines, imperialist nostalgia seems to originate from the Filipinos themselves, as Rizaldo discovered when they told him that the Philippines has indeed no authentic culture of its own. After all, they said, what could one expect from people who had spent 300 years in a monastery and a half-century in Hollywood, referring to 300 years of Spanish colonization and 50 years of American colonization. So, the multiplicity of Philippine cultures complicates these attempts to define what an authentic Philippine culture, performance, or identity is. Unlike some other countries in Southeast Asia, there's no singular tradition of Philippine performance associated with the country in the way that, say, wayang kulit is associated with Indonesia or the gamelan is associated with Indonesia. So while some consider these native forms, such as comedia and zarzuela, while some consider these native forms, these are more accurately products of colonial encounters. So comedia, which is like a kind of epic, originates from a Spanish form, and zarzuela is a sort of community musical form that also originates from Spain. And the vaudeville is derived from the American word vaudeville. The absence of this kind of authentic cultural tradition has produced a perception of Filipinos as especially then skilled at imitation. So Pico Arier, writing on the musical traditions of the Philippines, says that, quote, "The Filipino is master of every American gesture, conversant with every Western song, and therefore plays minstrel to the entire continent." Mimicry, the idea of mimicry, or gaya in Tagalog, is an issue of national self-determination, as the imitation of American culture can be seen as a colonial mentality, an internalized oppression manifesting ethnic and cultural inferiority. Performing like Westerners is assumed to be part of a larger process by which Filipinos come to prefer foreign-made products, watch Korean soap operas instead of telenovelas, attend Hollywood films rather than their own well-established film industry, and most controversially, move abroad for work. Mimicry was also a concern in the beginnings of the modern Philippine nation-state. In Jose Rizal's novel, Noli Me Tangere, which is considered the inspiration for the Philippine Revolution against the Spanish, the novelist depicts a grotesque vision of mimicry in the figure of Doña Consolacion, an old Filipina, he writes, much painted and rouged. Consolacion is a native woman married to a ruling class Spanish friar, with pretensions to Spanish identity in her dress and manners. While she is barely able to speak or understand Spanish, she pretends not to understand her own language, Tagalog. Consolacion is Rizal's caution against colonial mentality, and his political intervention lies in depicting the gap between the performance and the authentic self through satire. So hence, while Consolacion mimics the dress of upper-class Spanish women, her clothing is mismatched, her camisa is not silk but flannel, and she strides around San Diego chomping a big cigar. In other words, Consolacion's performance of mimicry is not at all successful. By contrast, today, concerns with colonial mentality center on the fact that Filipinos are maybe too successful now in their performances of mimicry. As J. Lorenzo Carrillo writes, quote, by reaffirming how commonplace American culture fits onto Filipino bodies, the mimicry stereotype breathes new life into colonialism by asserting the ordinariness of empire, end quote. So Filipino performativity, in other words, supports what Neferti X. Tadiar calls the unalterable fate of the Philippines as a kept mistress of the U.S. The Filipino subject is viewed as pliant and adaptable to the forms and idioms of the West, which rationalizes a post-Marcos economic policy that has made the Philippines heavily dependent on remittances from overseas contract workers, or OCWs, which make up now 13.5% of the Philippine GDP, although yesterday I read 15% in the most recent statistic. Labor is by far the largest export of the Philippines, while a small percentage of this labor is manual, for example, in the UAE or Dubai. The majority of OCWs spend their natural talent for mimicry in affective labor, nursing, childcare, palliative care, domestic help, and also call center work. The Philippines is a favorite destination for top left business process outsourcing, which is the euphemism that they use for call center work, and owing to a natural grasp of the English language and Western idioms. In 2013, the actual number of call center employees, but not per capita, but the actual number in the Philippines surpassed India, which is a country with a population 10 times greater. Performance, I suggest, erases the historical, political, economic, and ideological circumstances of Filipino labor. This erasure has a gendered dimension as it naturalizes the commodified, historically masculine labor surplus value of the OCW into activities of reproductive, historically feminine labor. For example, Filipinas are perceived to be wonderful nurses, making their labor part of the person rather than part of a job, despite the fact that this natural role was actually the product of a sustained campaign of American post-war politics, which included the creation of nursing schools as well as specialist visas. Indeed, as Catherine Choi has demonstrated, the work of nursing was perceived as menial and undignified by most Filipinas in the early 20th century. So how does cultural performance then contribute to or challenge this system of affective labor in everyday life? In the following section, I want to turn back to those viral videos and explore examples of Filipino mimicry through this concept of animatedness, whose double structure might provide a way of opening a gap between subject, body, and performance that over a century ago Jose Rizal did. So first, this is Sarah Geronimo. If there's anybody who has mastered the idea of mimicry in Filipino popular music, it's her. She's nicknamed the pop star princess, and she's known for covers of American popular songs on Philippine variety shows such as ASAP, which is the one we're watching now, or Ipulaga. As this video shows, she's skilled at mimicking both the vocal styles of these artists as well as their physicality and gestures. Even on her original Tagalog language songs, Geronimo's appears to be not so subtly aping the styles of other artists, from the Sierra-inspired choreography of her Awit Award-winning single Ikot Ikot to the fashionable EDM feel of the recent hit Kilometro. So despite what most would consider her lack of authenticity, her performances at the same time are undeniably moving. The effortless quality of her belting vocal register, which is called, the tradition is called birit in Tagalog, can raise goose flesh up the arm. One is reminded of Aaron Hurley's analysis of Celine Dion's performances, which hold an affective charge whether or not the conscious thought occurs that one likes or dislikes Celine. In this way, Geronimo's performances illustrate the double structure of animatedness, a perception that one is moved and that one is also moving. Sean Nye describes animatedness as the basic or most minimal of all affective conditions, that of being moved in one way or another. However, while seemingly neutral in context, she says, the affect becomes twisted into the image of an over-emotionalized, racialized subject, abetting his or her construction as unusually receptive to external control. Sean Nye's argument takes in early stop-motion animation as well as representations of puppets and dolls in literature and television to suggest that animatedness seems to function as a marker of racial or ethnic otherness in general. Coupled with a perception of liveliness and life in animatedness is a sense of objectification where one's body and voice is controlled by an invisible other. In other words, there are subjects who are animated and those who animate. It's not a coincidence that the rise of animatedness as an aesthetic affect, for example in silent film comedy, parallels a Taylorist Fordist paradigm of the automatized body. So the colonial gaze relies on both dimensions of animatedness. Firstly, viewing Filipinos as overly lively and not in control, and secondly, pliant and able to be animated. We can see this strongly in President William McKinley's declaration of the benevolent assimilation of American colonization. Regarding his decision to keep control of the islands after the Spanish-American War, he declared that, quote, there was nothing left for us to do but to take them and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed and went to sleep and slept soundly. So the civilizing animus of the American Empire, in McKinley's words, sounds like a sculptor with clay. It operated after this declaration through standardized education, universal adoption of English, and introduction of a bicameral political system. But today, the soft power of American pop culture is perhaps the strongest factor. So the viral spectacles of Filipino mimicry of American pop culture therefore suggest that something else is in play with the fascination of Filipino imitation, a sense of a body and voice animated from elsewhere. So for instance, the video Random Girl. In 2012, a YouTube user uploaded a video called And I'm Telling You Random Girl SM Mega Mall of a Filipino girl dressed and carrying a red backpack singing the Act 1 closer of the musical Dreamgirls at the karaoke tester. So another video soon appeared of her singing Whitney Houston's version of I Will Always Love You in the same karaoke tester display. Her Random Girl's powerful voice and striking capacity for imitating American singers led to this video going viral. Soon after, she was invited on the American talk show Ellen. She was identified finally as Zendi Rose Tenerefe, and she entered to the tune of South Korean artist Psy's Gangnam Style, which at that time was blowing up the internet, which is a kind of elision of Asian nations not even in the same part of the continent. This interview was interesting for the way in which Tenerife positions herself outside of the random girl discovery. She said, I am always going there, to Shumart, she says, to get attention from everyone. That's the only place you could go, Ellen DeGeneres replies, the white American talk show host. DeGeneres focuses on the discovery of this natural talent in an unlikely place, but Tenerife asserts a pleasure in performance and attention seeking, to which I'll later return. So a similar case was Charisse Pempenko, who was known as the little girl with the big voice. At only 15 years of age, her contralto caught the ears of producer David Foster, who helped develop her American career, in which she was presented as a kind of doll-like version of the glamorous American singers whom her vocals imitated. Oops.
When I was young, I never needed anyone. Making love was just for fun. Those days are gone. Living alone, I think of all the friends I've known. When I dial the telephone, nobody's home.
So in both of these videos for Tenerife and Charisse, there's an underlying fascination with Asian race bodies naturally performing American pop music, which when framed in these videos produces an uncanny experience for the viewer. The first Random Girl video abruptly starts with Tenerife already in performance. Shot from some distance, we are initially unable to match the amplified voice with a small, unassuming girl looking at the karaoke machine. It sounds like the voice is coming from elsewhere. The later clips, though, show Tenerife acknowledging her audience of shoppers, showing it is clear that she is aware of the effect of her voice. So we see the guy setting up the karaoke machine, and the fact that there's a crowd around him. This is I will review later. So I think in that little three-note melisma that she does there, there's quite a lot of, that's quite interesting, because clearly she's not performing in the way that, she's not imitating purely Whitney Houston at that point. It's a third higher than Whitney Houston actually sings in the song, and she takes a lot of pleasure, it seems. It seems that the performance itself is not actually matching the lyrical content of the song. So what isn't happening in this is the affect of a voice coming from elsewhere, separate from the body, and animating it. But that kind of effect becomes shared by clips of other, less viral Filipinos when we take a look at guys singing like Celine Dion. So another that clip is worth it just for that woman ducking out of the frame, I think. So all of these videos, I think the underlying spectacle is this idea of the animated Filipino performing body. So what I want to consider now in two examples is the Filipino performing body that is there and doing the animating. How might theatricality be a site for this shift in perception? So there's two examples now, and the first is Claude Michel Schoenberg and Elaine Beauville's mega musical Miss Saigon, which since its debut in 1989 has been a site of labor exchange between the global commercial theater and the Philippines. The musical required actors who were authentically East Asian looking but able to handle a difficult pop-infused score, and Manila became the ideal place to hold auditions. Since the 90s, Filipinos have appeared in productions of Saigon around the world, and indeed, Pinoy theater impresario Don Alegre has worked with Cameron Macintosh to find Filipino talents and develop them into what he calls Saigonistas in an informal Miss Saigon school. The current production, restaged in 2014 in the West End, holds the same pattern, 8 to 10 performers of Filipino nationality in the principal and ensemble cast at any one time. So resting on assumptions of Filipino mimicry, the Miss Saigon industry might therefore be considered a form of fantasy production, ideological spectacle which disguises neo-colonial relation. However, I argue that the compromised form of theater itself opens a gap for the agency of this performer to be perceived, since unlike the framing of viral Filipinos, the Filipino performing body in the theater performs affective labor in order to simulate affective situations. The current production of Saigon, directed by Lawrence Connor, has an eye for naturalism in numerous, aiming for filmic veracity, presenting Asian and non-Asian ensemble engaged in numerous everyday tasks around the intimate love story of the principals. Yet the naturalism of this dramatic representation is repeatedly punctured by the theatrical form of the musical, where bursting into song is naturalized. And bursting into song draws attention not only to the role, but the work of performing the role itself. In the frame of the theater, the excessive animatedness of the Filipino performing body is able to exceed its roles, perhaps, and trouble the very sense in which it has been racialized. We become fully aware of the embodied presence of the Filipino pop star Rachel Ann Go, who is was just playing Gigi in the musical, and not the character itself. We become aware of the way that Go moves or animates us. This presence is correlative to Lucy May San Pablo Burns' concept of puro arte, a term she draws from a Tagalog phrase meaning show or artifice. For San Pablo Burns, to be called out for being puro arte is to be questioned about one's veracity and authenticity, but is also recognition of the work and labor of that extravagance. Applied to the Filipino performing body as a site of mimicry, then, being puro arte can be thought of as a moment of recognition that what is animating the body is the body itself. After her appearance in Miss Saigon, Rachel Ann Go announced that she would be remaining in London and taking up another role in a West End musical, Fantine, Les Miserables' tragic heroine. Whereas in Saigon, Go played an Asian role, in Les Mis, Go effectively appears as a white character, an 18th century French seamstress. Her black hair is covered by a long blonde wig, and she wears the layered gowns of the period. This unsuccessful mimicry might put us in mind of Rizal's Doña Consolacion, where a gap between body and role is obvious and comical. Yet, unlike Rizal's caricature, when Go belts out the signature tune, I Dreamed a Dream, what is perceived in that gap is not mockery, but agency. In other words, when the work of performing the role is highlighted by the frame of the theater, the Filipino performer is read not only for her uncanny animatedness, but her ability to animate, shifting from mimicry to mimesis. So to conclude, I want to return to Doña Consolacion. Rizal was careful not to present her as just a caricature. In one emotional scene in the novel, she orders her servant Sisa to sing for her. Sisa responds by singing a kundiman, a melancholy, plaintive form of native Tagalog love poetry set to music. Listening to the music, Consolacion finds herself overwhelmed by grief or damay, and orders Sisa to stop singing in perfect Tagalog. The authentic strains of the kundiman have finally pierced through Consolacion's performance of colonial mimicry. So a viral video in 2014 illustrates an interesting parallel to Consolacion's awakening. Taken from the audition portion of the Philippine version of the global television show The Voice, the video depicts 4 judges, Sara Geronimo, the singer and presenter Bamboo, Lea Salonga, who starred in Miss Saigon, and Apple Daap of the rap group Black Eyed Peas, sitting as per the format with their backs to the singer Juvie Pavos.
Oh, man. What song is this now?
So the lyrics that she's singing are a million miles away from I Woke Up Like This. She's saying, Mula sa wala mundo ay nilika, gilit na mukha sa silaw na nagsimula. The sound of the music is unfamiliar, the judges share looks. What song is this, do you know? Solonga asks. As she reaches the high note of the chorus, all four judges turn their chairs around, captivated by the strains of what they now realize is the kundiman. The interruption of the voice, a TV show designed almost entirely to showcase the mimicry of the Filipino performer by the kundiman, would be expected to have a similar effect to Doña Consolacion's hearing of Sisa's song, reminding the Filipino viewer of the native authenticity that has been lost. But I suggest it actually asserts something rather different. Pelos's kundiman singing was framed not as some kind of ancestral tradition, but as part of her training, which she gained at a performing arts school. She later went on to use this training to compete in the battles where she was eliminated after singing Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. The traditional folk song, in the globalized and compromised fakeness of a television show like The Voice, indexes not a return to nativist authenticity, i.e. Filipinization, but rather what we might call the Philippines' mestizoness, the capacity, among other things, to speak in different registers, as if one's identity were overlaid and occupied by other possible ones. In other words, the liminal racialization of the Filipino performing body carries world-making or transformative potential viewed from the perspective of its possibility for asserting difference and ambiguity by foregrounding the discursive constructedness of subjectivity. Rather than holding on to a recognition of Filipino subjectivity as a goal, by beginning from an absent center, Pinoy performativity might remind us that a subject only becomes recognizable and can act as a subject by its conforming to certain regulatory matrices. In other words, the empty performance of imitation in the theatrical frame might allow us to view the performativity of all identities, showing that the Filipino performing body is not a product of history, but an agent of its process.
Thank you, Broderick.